name's Susan Hunter, and I'm the project coordinator for the Kinship Care Advice Service for Scotland, and we're hosting these events during the week in conjunction with our partner agencies. This is our second session in understanding trauma and helping recovery, and I'm delighted to welcome back Anne Wilson of Children's Health Scotland, who will be running a session for us all today. Anne's a very experienced and trusted partner of our service, and she works directly with many kinship carers. She's developed training and resources for lots of kinship carers and their groups, peer support groups, and she's a partner also on the Kinship Care Forum, which we sit on as well. And I can just say that feedback from the previous session was really positive, and the sessions are proving extremely popular. There'll be one or two of the team members taking part, and they won't be taking part, they'll be available. So as Simon's already mentioned, if you've got questions, etc., please add them in the chat or any comments, greatly received. And I'm now going to hand over to Anne to start the session. So thank you very much, Anne, and on you go.
Right. Hello, everybody, and I just want to say that how delighted I am to have been invited to present to you today on understanding trauma and helping recovery. We, as Susan said, we are colleagues on the Kinship Care Forum, and we developed a resource back in lockdown 1, which responded really to kinship carers' concerns about their children's behaviour, in terms of the behaviour being, I'd just say, more challenging than usual. And so we addressed this with a resource called Understanding Trauma. Now, we can send that out to you in the resources sheet that you will get following on from this webinar. And I'm just delighted. Where I can't see you, sadly, I would love to be with you in person, but as Simon said, the connecting link is the chat function and the Q&A. And I'm just so delighted. It's a beautiful, beautiful sunny spring day, and I just hope that you, having given up your time to be here now, you can still benefit from that sunshine outside. So without further ado, I'm just going to share my presentation. This is where you all have to hold your breath and fingers and toes crossed. And my colleagues will keep me right as to whether it's showing as it should do.
It's great. If you just start the slideshow, it'll be...
Yeah, I'm just trying to do that. Simon, hold on a second. Now that should be it, except I'm not on the right slide. Oh dear. Hold on a second, bear with me. We practiced. You wouldn't know that, but we did. I'm just going to have to go backwards till I get to the beginning, so to speak. There we are. Okay, are we good to go? Is that the front slide?
Perfect.
Great, fantastic. Okay, so this is the title that I mentioned, Understanding Trauma and Helping Recovery for Children and Young People in Kinship Care. And these will pop up with what we're aiming to do. Now, this is a taster session, and it is a bit of a contradiction in terms to say, oh, well, you're going to learn about trauma through a taster, as if. But I'm hoping that if we do these things, what do we mean when we talk about trauma? How do we define it? What's the brain got to do with it? And looking at some of the behaviours, challenges that are connected with trauma. And the fourth one is what helps recovery. And then this one here, find out about more resources of help. Now, that will come when you get the additional information following on from today's webinar. So we're talking about the brain, we're talking about the behaviours, we're talking about recovery, and we're looking at references. And we're hoping to do that in an hour. Now, some of you will remember, or may remember, the series of webinars that Suzanne Zedijk gave back in July last year, and that was in direct response again to kinship carers' concerns. And so we did very successful tripartite, three parts to the suite of webinars that she gave. But if you know Suzanne Zeedyke's work, and it'll be on the references, you will know that she is associated, and she developed this whole concept of the connectedness of babies. Now, you might know the word connectedness as attachment, if you understand about attachment. It is, in my view, it is the most important influence on the construction of a child's brain, and then becomes the basis of their personality, of their individual view, and of their view of others, and of their view of the world in general. It's the emotional connection with the caregiver. And if you are attuned and you are on the same page as the child in your care emotionally, that is one of the greatest gifts that you can give them. It's true to say that children that are insecurely attached to the various different forms can be more seriously affected by trauma. So going to the next slide, it just tells you a little bit more about that. That if you have this positive, secure attachment with the original caregiver, then that then underpins the child's whole world view. So in other words, again, it's how they see themselves, how they see other people, and how they see the world, based on the care and the nurture that they received as a tiny infant. It's not to say that if that care and that nurture was insufficient when they were babies and infants, and that you may well be thinking, yes, but that was the case. That's not to say that it cannot be repaired. The sort of window of repair, or the ability for the brain to repair, is immense, and for new pathways to be formed in response to the positive, nurturing, loving care that you are giving them. And they will form a new attachment with yourselves, almost at any point when they come to you, because of course you will all have had the children come into your care as kinship carers at different points in the child's development. But of course we know that if a child is insecurely attached, there will be information on the references about the different forms of insecure attachment. I think it's sufficient to know now that there are different forms, but basically, and they all come under the umbrella of insecure attachment. Then the child is going to be constantly, or possibly constantly, on high alert for threats coming from the outside environment or the home environment, and therefore be less able to focus on building relationships. So their social development is impacted, and their learning, because clearly if they are focusing on the risks that are coming at them, or the threats that are coming at them, and they have to deal with those and protect themselves and possibly other siblings, then they are not going to be able to devote time to exploring. They're just not going to have their freedom, the freedom to do that. And I think it's that we need to help them recover from. So what is trauma? So I could just read this to you. A trauma is a psychologically distressing event that is outside the range of usual human experience. Trauma often involves a sense of intense fear, terror, and helplessness. Now, we can theorize about trauma till we're blue in the face, but I think that storytelling and examples is one of the best ways to explain what trauma is. And there will be a few examples in the next coming slides. But what I want to say to this slide is that we do need to differentiate between what we call single event trauma. So that all of us, if I asked you to get in touch with a traumatic moment in your lives, you possibly all could, and you would be able, perhaps in your mind's memory, to get in touch with how that felt. Don't worry, I would not ask you to do it. That's something that we might explore in a fuller length workshop. But what I want to say is that childhood trauma is different because it goes on over a period of time. Now, some people call it chronic trauma, some people call it developmental trauma. For me, it's the trauma which comes from their insecure attachment in their early years experience, their early life. But on top of that, layered on top of that, possible neglect, possible abuse. And that, sadly, there's a tendency for that to be far more than a single event. If they are living in that situation, you'll see that from the next slide, then it will be ongoing. So we do need to think about it in those two different ways. So this tells you quite a bit about trauma, and I'm just going to paraphrase it, because what you will get slides after the webinar, and what I would like you, I would have hoped that you could perhaps go back to this in the light of today, and dare I say, in the light of, if you're coming to the brain and trauma webinar tomorrow, in the light of all your trauma knowledge, come back to this and reflect, because we do need to reflect on it. So we've talked about the single event or the many events. Children who are living in vulnerable situations are commonly traumatized all the time by living in this chronic situation. So again, it says it's different from the single reaction overpowering event that I mentioned previously. I think this is summarizing a lot of what we have already said, because we've mentioned that if they have poor, insecure attachments, they are more likely to be more severely affected by the trauma that comes on top of that insecure attachment. But the interesting thing is that for many children, this is their norm. If they are affected in this way, they often don't appreciate that actually these things that they are experiencing are out of the ordinary. It is their reality, and they come to learn to cope with it. Now, we wouldn't want that to be the case, but they have to learn to cope with it in order to survive and in order to function, as you will see when you see the slide on the brain and how it's involved. And again, interestingly, these children often can't remember the details. So you now, as kinship carers, are unlikely to be able to get back to that original situation that the child was living in, because they may not have the language or the, well, first of all, they have to have the memory. Now, a bit about the memory, you'll have heard of the fear response and the fight and the flight and then the freeze. So if they can't fight, unlikely, and they can't run away, flight, maybe unlikely, they will freeze. They will freeze to protect themselves and disassociate. So that all goes along with the fact that they probably genuinely can't remember. And they certainly, if they can, or they won't have the words or the language, it may be pre-verbal, in their pre-verbal stage before they had language, but they certainly won't be able to express it to you. But the body keeps the score. And you can see in that last bullet point there that it only takes a perfume, a particular sight, color of hair, voice, or other trigger to trigger the memory and cause that original trauma from the early birth experience to resurface. So in some senses, all of the trauma that the behavior from the trauma and the effects of the trauma now that you're dealing with are resurfacing from that early experience. It's not new trauma, but it's held in the body. And that's what is so difficult to deal with because it's difficult to see what it is and what it was. And it's almost like a flashback. And the body is wired to do that. It has to, because that's how it survived. So I just want to say one more thing about the understanding of trauma, is this business of COVID. Now, this is where this all came from, because this was what was brought to our attention in the Kinship Care Forum, with all the organisations that support kinship carers in that forum, were all reporting the same thing. And we all came to the conclusion with others that it was because the COVID situation actually mimics the early birth experience. So if you think about it, you had death and illness, and there was a huge focus in lockdown 1 on death, and children were watching the news and television, and they picked up on adults' anxiety. There was loss of, I don't mean loss through death of relationships, I mean just loss because they didn't see people, and they didn't see loved ones because we weren't allowed to see people. We couldn't visit, we couldn't go into houses. There was maybe lack of money or lack of food. There was massive uncertainty. You know, it was from one minute to the next. Can we go out? Can we go to school? We went to school, then we came back again. And it was like this roller coaster of uncertainty, with boundaries being very indistinct and lack of routine. And adults, the best will in the world, all the adults around the children, even if the adult is doing their level best not to display anxiety, the children are very sharp at picking up when an adult is anxious or stressed. They are almost, you know, they have antennae coming back on themselves. So it's extraordinarily difficult to keep it from them, nor should we. But if you add in all of these things, you've got this reminder of that original trauma where all of these things may well have been present. And so COVID had this huge impact on the children, and it did enable us to shine a light on what was going on for them, and therefore better understand them. Now, I'm going to leave this one for you to watch at your leisure, partly because it's a little bit longer, but I want to go to the next one. I will summarize what's in it. We've already talked about quite a bit of it, but it is really worthwhile listening to Dita, the CAM specialist, on this topic. So she talks about the triple whammy. So it's got 3 parts to it. She talks about the insecure attachments. She talks about the impact then of, in addition to that, the impact of neglect, abuse and trauma on that original insecure attachment. And then she says that the third whammy means that all of these things together put the child out of our reach, and it makes them very difficult to help. Makes them difficult to reach because, and we have touched on this, because they've actually frozen or gone into a disassociation, we call it, where they've separated themselves off from what's going on in order to survive. And I learned, I mean, I was struck the other day on another webinar about carers who were saying, well, it's all very well, you know, we're counselled that perhaps we should try to help them to, not life story work in its formal meaning, but get in touch with what happened to them, to help them to explore it, to make sense of it. But they said, you know, we've tried that with our children, and they actually don't want to go there. They don't want to rock the boat. And that was a big wake-up call for me, because I had always thought that it was too difficult because of the things I mentioned previously, that they can't actually remember the early trauma, and they can't describe it because they don't know the language. But now I am going to reflect strongly on the fact that the children, quote unquote, don't want to rock the boat. So It's a delicate balancing act. Now, the next slide, I would just like you to watch it and to think to yourself, what do I understand that's going on here? Now, obviously, there isn't an opportunity for a sort of to and fro, a discussion afterwards, although you can put things in the chat. But what's going on here? What do you understand is happening? What happened before and what might happen after? So I'm just going to move forward to... No.
So I'm going to be talking.
That always happens. I want to go to the next slide. Ding. Yes. Okay.
I don't get what the problem is here, Craig. I mean, I gave you ample time to prepare, didn't I? Everyone else seems to have managed it. Why should you be any different? I've had enough of this attitude, Craig. Really, I have. That you have the audacity to stand here and... Look, I've told you before, haven't I? Do you never learn? Craig, are you listening to me? What have you got to say for yourself? And look me in the eye when I'm talking to you. Did your mother not teach you any manners?
Okay. It was short and not sweet. And I wondered if you were able, as you watched, to see that as the dressing down from the English teacher, who of course had made no attempt to find out why Craig hadn't done his homework, it was just, you've done this, therefore you've done something wrong. And it was that whole disciplinarian punishment routine. Did you notice as the clip went on, it started to fragment as Craig's memory, the trauma is rekindled. He's got a male shouting at him in the form of the English teacher, but of course that takes on the form of the head of his father, who you saw as a dim, shadowy figure with toys around. So he's flashed back through the trauma memory to his childhood when he had to witness the abuse of his mother at the hands of the father that you saw there. And Craig, if Craig managed to stay out of the way, that was the best he could hope for. But of course, as we know, the worst he could hope for was that he actually witnessed the abuse of his mother. So there you can see that when he's confronted with a similar situation as he's now he's in S3, so he's likely to be 15, round about there. His brain will do no other because he has to survive, and so that takes over, and it knocks the rational brain, what we call the frontal cortex, for those of you who are into neuroscience, the rational part of the brain, the thinking part of the brain, it knocks it offline in the interests of survival. So of course he dashes off, and then there is a whole case study attached to this, which I could include, but in the end, although he's excluded from school, it's all reinstated when the head teacher gets to find out, and this time she investigates what's going on, and she finds out that he needs help, not punishment. So, and I just wanted to share with you one or two of the behaviours. I mean, obviously we saw Craig dashing away. He didn't assault the English teacher, but it would be possibly reported as something akin to that. We heard of children in kinship care running away in lockdown 1. And interestingly, the boy who ran away from one kinship carer ended up going to the other granny because the other granny wasn't working. and she could give him the care and the nurture and the attention. But of course, nobody understood that at the outset. He'd just run away. And so it's very complex. Children locking themselves in their rooms, not coming out. Were they mimicking lockdown, or were they just feeling so overwhelmed that they couldn't cope, or was it a protest? Other young people completely trashing the house in a manner that disproportionate to how they normally are. But at the same time, and I will share this with you later when we come to recovery, the kinship carers were so impressed by the fact, they were impressed, of course, as you would be, by the unexpected negative behaviour, but they were even more impacted by the fact that when the child came out of the lockdown, out of the meltdown, they were so contrite and so apologetic and so back to their normal old selves. So I just wanted to share with that. The next slide shows you what the brain is doing in all of this. Blame the brain. Sorry. Seems to have a notion to do that. Okay, what's the brain up to? Blame the brain. Now don't worry, I'm only going to show you two here. There is number 6. If you can see the cursor hovering, is the hippocampus, and that is the memory system in the brain, and it stores memories even when you don't know they're there, and you can't retrieve them yourself necessarily until along comes the threat, and then the brain remembers them. Now, if we go to the amygdala, that's the almost like the fear sensor part of the brain, if you like, and if you trace it back, it's a tiny little lump deep in the heart of the old brain, and it's involved in alerting all of the rest of the brain, and therefore also the body, to a threat or danger. Now, without this, we could not have run away from the woolly mammoths or the saber-toothed tigers. I know Suzanne likes to talk about saber-toothed tigers and teddy bears, but we would not, in our early evolutionary phase, have been able to survive without the amygdala, the fear center in the brain, which will send the brain into an alarm state at the least indication of trouble. Now, there's no point in saying, oh yes, but we know that's not a real threat. That was just a noise. There's absolutely no point, because it will get there first and it will have sent the brain into alarm state, and this cascade of emotions happens. And you'll see these in a couple of slides' time, to get the body ready for fight or flight. So that's going to happen automatically. So I did want to share one other story with you to show you the fight or flight bit. I'll go on to look at the brain as a drug box, and then I'll do that other story. So here we are. Did you know that the brain is a drug box? And again, if we had time, space and time, I'd be saying to you, do you know the names of any of the drugs that are in the brain? But I will include a link in the references called, it's a wonderful website that kind of personalizes all of these chemicals, if you like, or hormones in the brain. But the important one for trauma is this one called cortisol. So this one is released again when the brain detects a threat. And this is what it does. It puts an absolute damper on all the brain systems to do with relaxation, to do with learning, because the child, remember, is on high alert, hypervigilant, and not able to take their eye off the ball to focus on learning. And that's why you often see children in school adversely affected. And nowadays, fortunately, there's a huge drive in schools to raise awareness amongst whole school staff about this issue, so that they're understanding where it's coming from. And it's not what's wrong with the child, it's what's happened in the past and happening to them now. But equally and luckily, probably, there is another one called oxytocin. And some of you will know this one as the so-called birth hormone. It is the hormone that is present when a mother gives birth. But although it's there, it is also the love hormone. Now, if you can get yourself in touch with what it feels like to have a cuddle from a loved one, or to hold a loved one's hand, and I know this is so difficult just now because we can't, but we're hearing so much about being able to go back and visit their loved ones in care homes, and just that whole warm, welcoming feeling that you get. And it's got nothing to do with romantic love or sexual attraction or anything like that. It's what you get from carer to child, you get from friend to friend. And it can just be a smile, a cuddle, a hug, a smile, a look, and you get that warm, affirming feeling. They say that the shortest distance between two people is a smile. And I did promise I would tell you the story about the trauma memory. I don't know, I hope I've got time. Very quickly, this was a boy who came into kinship care. He was, if you like, he was the older of the siblings, so he had some responsibility for the rest of them. And one night, and he was with his granny and the other siblings, and one night the granny reported that there was a loud crash from the hall cupboard. Now, all it was the Hoover falling over. It was one of these random acts that there's never any rhyme or reason to it, it just happened. But he came bringing out of his bedroom, brandishing his baseball bat. Now, unbeknownst to the granny, he went to bed every night with the baseball bat under his pillow. Why? Because when he was in his birth family, it was a not uncommon occurrence for the house to be busted by the police, and they would, with no uncertain terms, just, you know, rush through the house, or the drug gangs were coming in through the window without opening it first. And this poor boy lived in this constant state of high alert, so he went to bed prepared. When the Hoover fell over, he was unable to stop and think, oh yeah, that's the Hoover in the hall cupboard. No, the brain went absolutely directly to boom, that time in the past, and he was all systems go, red alert out there. Fortunately, the granny was able to, not at the time, but she was able to address that whole thing with him in a calm, receptive moment, and they had a talk about it, they had a conversation about it, so he's helped to make sense of that. So this is what some of the 4 principal things that are going to help spontaneous recovery from trauma. Now, the support of attuned carer is you, and if you can be on the same page as them, that is fantastic. If you can get in touch with a previous positive experience, perhaps through a memory box or a photograph, ways to recapture that joy, then that helps as well. We've talked about early help to process the experience, to make sense of it. And then the very important healthy coping skills, the resilience and self-care. And by self-care, I mean for you as well as them. And the resilience is something that we'll look at in some of the slides a little bit further on. So I'm going to look at the next one. It's interesting, we've talked about this actually, the fundamental question, it's not what's wrong with you, that's just too simplistic, going back to the English teacher, it's what's actually happened to the child. If we only look at the behaviour, then we won't be able to understand. But if we regard the child as in need of help, and if I could almost say victims of that early adverse experience, then it totally reshapes the way we view their behaviour, and it goes a long way to helping the situation. Now, they do have a right to recovery. It is their fundamental right to recover. And I was on a webinar for the cross-party group at the Scottish Parliament last night for ACEs, Adverse Childhood Experiences. And the Deputy First Minister was speaking. And the day before that, I was on the Kinship Care Week webinar where there was the Q&A with the Minister, Marie Todd, and I'm delighted to tell you that the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child is now enshrined in domestic law, in Scots law. So, but it's the recovery thing that I wanted to focus on here. I'm going to keep going just now because I think we might be a little bit behind time for where we want to be. This just shows you that right to recovery again. It's Article 39 in the Convention if you want to have a look. And I love this cartoon because it is a first aid box. And in some senses, we're helping them to recover from trauma, which is almost like an injury. It's an injury to the brain in a way. But I just love the fact that inside there are not bandages and sticking plasters and TCP and so on and so forth. There are these qualities of self-respect, hope, self-confidence, and dignity. And this is what we are so wanting to develop in our young people. The next slide shows a series of different techniques, if you like, or strategies or resources to support a child recovering from trauma or the impact of trauma. Now, I don't pretend this is not inclusive in any way. We heard on Monday's webinar, we got some wonderful suggestions from yourselves or your peers in terms of their suggestions, and we're collecting these. KCAS is going to collect them and we'll put them in this reference sheet, this resource sheet that we send you out. So forgive me if this doesn't include your favorite. I just want to give you a brief overview. So without further ado, I'm just moving to this one, and I'm just going to do a kind of cherry pick here. We talked about stories last time, and you can say to me, oh, but my child's a teenager, stories is not going to cut it. So you change it to maybe watching a film with them, and maybe any opportunity you get, commenting on if the film showed someone displaying resilience to recover from difficulty, then you kind of comment and you say, you know, you engage them in conversation. It's so different from trying to sit them down and eyeball them and talk to them directly about themselves, because don't forget, they're actually hiding away. They may have very low self-esteem. They may not want to talk about themselves, but if we can do it through a third party, then that is so powerful. We've got a deal on just now, which on our Facebook pages, which I would encourage you to visit. We've got what we call Story with Rory. Some of you will know, if you've got younger children, about Rory Crawford, who's the CBeebies man, and he is reading stories for us just now. And he's got an absolute fabulous one that we've selected specifically for Kinship Care Week, called Can't You Sleep, Little Bear? And it's been animated by him. He talks about kinship care very eloquently. We gave him the script. And I'm just so aware that when I listened again, I loved it with my children, but when I listened again, I thought, this is so spot on for children in kinship care and their fears. And when often I'm told about the difficulties of going to bed at night, going to sleep at night, because of course that's when, quote unquote, all the bad things happen. If I move to the memories and the photo memories, and we've talked a little bit about the memory box, and I am not talking about the memory box necessarily for bereavement through death, though it can be, because so very many of the carers that I work with are coping with their own grief at the loss of an adult birth parent, but that is the parent of the children, the grandkids who are currently in their care. And some of the stories there are so moving. And in fact, I did want to share one with you. And I think I should probably just go for it now. Well, I'll pick up on it just at the end of this bit here. So I've seen carers be able to get back to a precious moment in time, never mind the trauma moments, the precious moment in time through a photograph taken in the sea on holiday with the water splashing up and the sheer joy on the face of the young person and the interaction between them and the carer. And so you can go back to that moment of sheer joy and pure bliss retrospectively through the photograph and try to capture that feeling of that warm feeling again. And we also heard stories of children, I mentioned before, young people locking themselves away in their rooms, isolating themselves. They wouldn't even come out for meals. And I remember one carer was terribly worried about the amount of time that her boy was spending on his digital appliances, and she was really, and we ran a session on digital safety, and it was really moving. It was a Zoom session. The kinship carer was there, and just towards the end of the session, she said, "Oh, things are going to change round here in my house." And all of a sudden, you were aware that the young person hadn't come out of their room. This was unheard of. They'd come out of the room and they were hovering just off camera and communicating with the kinship carer because they detected that she was on a session that was all to do with digital access and digital safety. And they actually engaged. There was a kind of moment when we engaged, and I think I said to them, although I couldn't see him, I think I said, "You'll maybe be able to help your grandma with the IT." And there was a, "Yeah, I can do that." And it was the most powerful moment. And just that memory of her saying, "Aye, things are going to change around here," I've never, ever forgotten that. So there's a couple of closer in examples. Oh, the school one comes next. I'm still watching the time because I am wanting to leave time for questions. Be assured that the schools are very much working towards the same thing, because there's absolutely no point if kinship carers were working away to help recovery from trauma if schools were doing something totally different. But I can guarantee you that clip that you saw of the English teacher is not what it's like now. And so I would encourage you to reach out to your schools and close the loop and create that two-way street where you know what's going on in school and school knows what's going on for your young person at home. And therefore you can do this wraparound trauma-informed approach. Now, trauma-informed is the watchword for schools, nurture approach is the watchword for schools, and compassionate connected classrooms. So please, please reach out to schools. They are different places now. And some of them are doing wonderful, wonderful things for your young people. I wanted to introduce you to just the resilience alphabet and the fact that resilience is really what we need to focus on building up. And you will see in the key final takeaway messages, the final thoughts, that building up resilience and doing any of these things is not possible while they're in their meltdown. That has to flow through and keeping them safe and yourself safe. But we then need to find the calm moment to try to reach them and engage them in some of these things. Now, the alphabet is fabulous because you can download it through the link. It's got sound. D might be for downtime, K might be for kindness. And one of the best things, I mean, it isn't an old wives' tale, or it may be that laughter is the best medicine, but actually, remember that smiling at someone, that holding them in your eyes, and that engaging. Laughter can absolutely do wonders, and laughter is the L in the alphabet. So you could choose one for yourself, and they could choose one, and then you could compare notes. And it is based on a think about it, say it, do it. You're building the resilience in these quiet moments. It's not a quick fix at the moment of trauma, nor can it be. And the next slide shows you quite a bit about feelings and emotions. And of course, as we've said before, the young person mightn't have the language to describe how they're feeling. So we can't say to them, how are you feeling today? Because they won't be able to describe it. And even if they could describe it, they might not know, because they've never had that. It's something that we really almost need to learn. And so these are just examples of, you can do it with emojis. You can do it with emotion works, which is not shown here, but is used in schools. And there's some wonderful work going on in schools where children are really, through drawings and through stories, getting in touch with their feelings. The kit bags that you can just see there is used universally throughout Fife schools, and it does have a cost attached, I would have to say, but I have encountered kinship carers who've invested in it, and it's full of wonderful activities with colours and animals and smells and perfumes and cards, and just anything which helps but is not directly, oh, how are you feeling today? Because that's going to not take us very far. It's enabling the young person to express and give vent to their feelings through what we call a joint activity. So that's like a parallel activity. Something else is going on at the same time. So they might be playing a game, but the game is about feelings. So they're not, it's two things are happening, and the spotlight is not on, oh, to the young person, now can you talk to me? And I'm always reminded that the car is a great confessional, because you cannot look at them if you're driving. You have to, obviously, one hopes you have to look straight forward, and they're looking straight forward. So you're not eyeballing them, but they're sometimes able to express things that they can't if you're just sitting face to face. And the listening is another very, very important aspect of, we've got the resilience, the feelings, and the listening. The listening and the feeding back to them, the active listening, which involves observing them. Now, of course, it's very hard to observe your child while you're trying to cook the tea and doing all the 1,000,001 24/7 things that you have to do. But if you can pause to get that reflection or that moment, it's worth its weight in gold. And these are just the final key messages from the session, that I wanted to share with you. The two most important things, the fact that you can't, there are no quick fixes. So the resilience and the recovery is something that you build up over time in the quiet time. So you catch them in the receptive, calm moment, and you know that whatever you're doing around resilience and recovery, whichever the many activities, is going to support their well-being, emotional well-being, and maybe over time reduce the number of traumatic meltdowns because you're building the resilience. And the reconnecting is vital, absolutely vital, and it is possible. And I wanted to share with you how totally blown away I have been this year from carers who are able to reconnect after the moment of madness when the house is, and I'm not joking, trashed and you've had to get another telly for the third time. But the reconnection, and carers are saying, but he's a really lovely boy, and you know, he was out with the school and they reported him as being wonderful, funny, good company, helpful, and that's almost like the real child. And these kinship carers that have spoken to me have been so, and you know, they didn't have to say it, they came out and said it. And for me, that is the glimmer, or more than a glimmer of hope, that is a wide open window of hope. That's what the children are. The trauma and the effects of the trauma is something that has been impacted on them way back in their childhood. But the fact that the kinship carer can say, but they're marvelous, they're really good kids, really, as I say, it impressed me, it overwhelmed me, I would have to say. And so I want to end there because I really want to leave. I know we don't have very much time, but I'll stop sharing and come out and see you all again. Okay.
Fantastic, Anne. Thank you so much.
So I don't know what we've got, questions or chat. Did you want to relay?
Well, let's have a little look. There was something being popped into the chat. There was a question that somebody had asked about regarding movies to watch with children. Just wondering if there's any that you would recommend.
There's one, but I would have to check the title. Of course, there's more than one. I think it's Frozen, but I need to check which number it is. Can I come back on that?
Yes, of course. Yep, that's absolutely fine.
But that's a great question. Yeah. So let me come back. I don't want to sort of misremember titles.
No, that's cool. No, that's fine. And again, we are awaiting if anybody has any questions or has any points to raise on the back of that presentation from Anne. Fantastic as always, Anne. Thank you so much. I think everybody has been stunned into silence today. There's a few thanks coming into the chat function already. But last call, perhaps, if anybody has any questions, to maybe utilize that Q&A function or to pop anything into the chat if anybody has any thoughts. And can I just reassure the person that was asking about the movies, what will happen is that when we're recording this webinar, when it is edited and sent out, we will also be sending out some of the links that Anne was talking about in the resources, and we will include the name of that film as well.
Yeah. Can I just say to everybody, I just so regret that I can't be there with you, you know, in person, and I thank you for all your comments and everything. And what I'm really trying to say is there was far too much of me talking, and no, you know, and the contributions from you are there, but they're in the chat. That's just the nature of the particular format at the moment. I hope that we'll be able to do something in a more extended time frame later, as time goes on, later on.
Absolutely, and who knows, Anne, we might even be able to get to meet each other face to face at some point and be able to actually do something that way. That would be absolutely fantastic. Gosh, remember those days when we could look at each other in a room.
I know.
So we have a question that's popped in. Thank you for that. The question is, how do you approach trauma when both the caregiver and the child share similar trauma? and finds it hard to approach the deep discussion that needs to take place to help the child?
That's a very good question. Interesting. I didn't actually name secondary trauma there, but and I do think it's very important. I would say, and this is not a cop-out, but I think one approach would be to seek professional help, because you've got to know that inevitably the trauma from the child is going to affect the carer, but equally, especially in kinship care, that carer will be affected as well, maybe by the same trauma. I'm reminded, and this was the story that I wanted to share with you. A kinship carer was telling me that how acutely difficult it was to, in the final stages of her adult daughter's, I'm allowed to say drug addiction, if she was caring for her adult daughter, who of course was the mother of the young boy. And when the adult daughter sadly passed away, in the aftermath, the young boy, who was only 12, said to his grandmother, "I want to speak at my mum's funeral." And the grandmother said, "No, you're too young. That's not going to, she wasn't convinced. However, she did let him speak at the funeral to 400 people. And this goes back to one of the questions that we got asked on Monday. What do I say if the mum was not, if the mum, I hesitate to say, but I'm quoting, was a bad person? How do I say that to the child? Well, this shines a huge light on it, because this young boy, remember, who was only 12, he stood up in front of 400 people at the funeral, and he said, "I'm doing it because I want to tell you that my mum was a good person. She should not be defined by the drugs that she took. She was a wonderful person, and needless to say, there was not a dry eye in the house." But the carer, that's an example of where the carer was impacted by similar trauma, but of course it would take a different form in her. And her grief is very complex, because it's her grief for her adult daughter, but it's also her grief seeing her grandsons struggle. And obviously the funeral was hugely cathartic, and she did get help later on, but she went to a professional, she went to an organization to get that help. So I don't know if that goes some way to answering the question. I don't feel it's a full answer, but again, I can maybe come back to that. So thank you. Thank you for asking it.
No, thank you. And blocked care is a term that's utilised sometimes as well to describe how that caregiver is actually feeling and dealing with the day-to-day situation because of the trauma that they are experiencing and have experienced. And it's a real tough one to get out of, really, really difficult. And I hope that you're able to get the support that you need to actually change that situation around.
Yes.
Another message that's popped into the through the chat, actually. So considering trauma for this person's granddaughter, Monday wasn't a very good day, and there's been lots of mixed messages from family members. Doesn't really expand on what the mixed messages were around, but the question is, how do you deal with mixed messages from other family members?
That's a hard one. Yeah. I don't know whether in that case there's any support from the local authority or what the nature of the kinship placement is, and whether there is an overview or any kind of mediation. I think it's one that you would almost need to know more about that one.
Yeah.
I'm not trying to, it's not a cop-out exactly, but I don't know.
It's a fair point, Anne, and again, I would emphasise to anybody who's affected by any of the things that Anne has spoken about so eloquently today, and also for any of you that are thinking about what's been asked today as well. And in fact, you can actually just see popped into the chat, as I've done it, my colleague Linda, who's the helpline advisor, has actually put the details of our helpline from the Kinship Care Advice Service Scotland. It's open Monday to Friday, 10 in the morning till 2:30. If you're not feeling particularly comfortable, or if the wee one is around or other family members are around, please visit the website, where there'll be an opportunity for you to get in touch. There's also several handouts, leaflets and fact sheets available there, but also we're available by email. So please don't, there's lots of ways to get in touch with us, and we will get back in touch, and we will support in the best possible way that we can. So again, thank you to Linda for actually just expanding on some of the stuff that's been put in there. In fact, it's just sitting in there in the chat should anybody need that. So please don't hesitate to get in touch.
Thanks, Simon. I guess I could liaise a bit with Linda on some of the responses, and then she could feed them back to the individual people who'd asked them. Would that be a thing?
That would be fantastic, Anne. We've got your email, and I'm sure Linda will have access to that as well should we need to get in touch, so that would be fabulous.
Absolutely, great.
Appreciate that. That's great. Thank you.
Thank you, thanks.
Okay then, folks, so the messages, the chat seems to have dried up, the Q&A seems to have dried up as well. We're a little bit past our time, it's 25 to 3, so unless anybody has anything else that they would like to offer in the Q&A and the chat, I will bring this webinar to an end with a huge thank you to Anne again for her time, her knowledge, and her ability to get really tricky points over in a very friendly and accessible way. Thank you so much. And it's a real skill to be able to get a very difficult subject across as well as you do. So thank you for joining us twice during Kinship Care Week.
Thank you, Simon. I just want to say an enormous thank you to the kinship carers, because they have taught me so much. I mean, I would not understand the theory without what the kinship carers themselves have taught me through lived experience, and I just want to say that.
Okay, well, thank you. It's true. It's true. Everybody that's involved in the kinship care service or has some aspect of wanting to help or is associated in different organisations, at the very heart of all of that are the kinship carers, and we never lose sight of that, and that'll always be our focus going forwards. And I'm not too sure if it's true or not, but we have actually had somebody from Pennsylvania in the USA on the webinar today. So a real international field to Kinship Care Scotland Week. So on that bombshell, we shall end the webinar. So thank you very much for everybody.